We're going to hear from Rear Admiral Phillip Sawyer on the role of submarines in US Pacific strategy. Admiral Sawyer is commander of Submarine Force US Pacific Fleet. He graduated from the US Naval Academy in 1983. He has a master's degree in engineering management from Old Dominion University, a title that would make a Commonwealth country's heart glad, Phil. He's been a career submarine officer. He served as a division officer on the USS Bluefish, an engineering officer on the Florida, executive officer of USS Salt Lake City, and he's had command assignments on board the USS La Jolla and of the Submarine Squadron 15 in Guam. He's had an extensive range of shore duty assignments, many of them associated with submarine matters. Deputy Director for Operations at Commander Submarine Force US Pacific Fleet, Executive Assistant to the Deputy Commander-in-Chief US Pacific Fleet, on the Bureau of Naval Personnel as the Submarine Force Placement Officer, a popular job, I imagine, that one. Instructor of the Fleet ASW Training Center, Chief of Staff of the US Strategic Command Special Activities, and Commander Submarine Force Atlantic. He's also served as Vice Commander of Naval Mine and Anti-Submarine Warfare Command, and was most recently commanding Submarine Group 7 in Yokosuka, Japan. So an encyclopedic background of all things submarine and related. Please welcome Rear Admiral Sawyer.
I heard this little voice, something about it better be good. And as I was talking to some of the folks earlier, I said, hey, you get what you pay for when you come to speeches by me. So I'm not sure if that applies. But let me, first of all, thank you, Peter, for the introduction. And it is my pleasure, and I appreciate ASPI inviting me out here to speak on U.S. submarine forces, and particularly here in the Pacific. Before I go farther, though, I would like to kind of follow my own slogan, which is, if you're not early, you're late. And so to the Australian Submarine Force and the Submarine Force Enterprise, let me wish you a happy birthday. We can sing tonight at the dinner if you want. And I would like to say I'd like to be around for the second 100 years, but I think that may be asking a little bit too much. The other thing I would tell you is these events, and we have events similar to this in the United States, and one of the great advantages, I think, of attending an event like this is the ability to kind of see people you haven't seen in a while. Sometimes you see them every day and you get to see them more, but it's a chance to network, a chance to talk with old shipmates, comrades, that type of thing. And last night at the reception, a good friend of mine came up, Colonel Nong from Singapore, and he came up to me and he had kind of a worried look on his face, and so we had a chance to talk a little bit, and I was trying to figure out, okay, what's he concerned about, and then Admiral Ducci, an acquaintance I made last night, also joined with the colonel, and I could see them both were a little bit concerned, and I said, okay, hey. What is the deal here? And their concern was, I was the first guy after lunch. And so I was going to set the ground for everybody who followed me, and the folks who follow me are those two guys right there. So if you end up nodding off later on, it's because of what I've said at this presentation as opposed to what anybody else says after me. And I am always pleased and happy to talk about the U.S. Submarine Force. And I think with our host country here of Australia, we have a long history, both as nations, as navies, and as submarine forces. And earlier in some of the briefings, the discussion turned to World War II. And I would tell you that my predecessor, 70 years ago, Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who was ComSubPAC during most of World War II, was also the commander of Allied Naval Forces, Western Australia. His deputy commander was then Commodore John Collins. And we also showed the Farm Cove picture of submarines in Brisbane. Brisbane has been a favorite resupply and rest port for U.S. submariners, both World War II and now. And I'm very grateful, and while I have not had a chance to go down and see the submariners walk, I am very grateful to the Submarine Association Australia Queensland for their dedicated efforts in building the lasting tribute there to submariners from both our countries. Today, I have a small team of U.S. submariners stationed in Perth, and they're there in direct support of the Australian Submarine Force. Likewise, the Australian Submarine Force has a small team of submariners in Pearl Harbor, which directly support my forces. So the submarine force bonds that we forged probably during the darkest days of World War II remain healthy, strong, and mutually beneficial between our countries. So today I intend to broadly discuss where my submarine forces contribute to our broader Navy goals, what I see as the U.S. Submarine Force role here in the Pacific, in the region, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are some common, I'll say, tactical level issues or concerns that all of us should be concerned with in this region. Well done. So first, let me start with giving you a snapshot of U.S. submarine forces. And I recognize that most of you are very familiar with these, and so I will be brief. But first, and I think very importantly, the U.S. Submarine Force remains a very strong submarine force. We are well maintained, we are exceptionally manned, and I'm very comfortable in our ability to conduct any task in giving. This chart shows our primary headquarter locations throughout the world. Already, we have 60% of the U.S. submarine force is located in the Pacific. Of our 19,000 submariners, 11,000 are stationed in the Pacific. I have 30 SSNs under my operational control, 8 SSBNs, and 2 SSGNs, guided missile submarines. I also operate 2 submarine tenders in the Western Pacific. One is generally in the Western Pacific. The other roams between the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific. And as ComSubPAC, I am responsible for the man, train, and equip functions. And in general, I provide ready forces to the forward operational commander in Yokosuka, Japan. That was the job that I held immediately prior to taking over as SubPAC. Now, I'll apologize in advance for this slide. I usually show this slide when I talk about the Western Pacific, and I do it for 2 reasons. One is to show people, as I talk about a maritime environment, really what I mean, and that the Western Pacific, the Asia-Pacific region is indeed a maritime environment. And also, whenever the discussion comes up about distances, it's nice to have a chart like this, a graph like this to demonstrate. Today, I recognize you understand the maritime issue and the distance issue, so it's just going to be my backdrop. So my Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Greenert, to provide context in which to help inform future decisions and to guide our actions, published his guiding principles in a document called Sailing Directions. And within his sailing directions are 3 tenets that he tells us we should use to inform our decisions. These 3 tenets are warfighting first, operate forward, and be ready. So let me touch on each of these tenets and briefly describe how the Pacific submarine forces contribute to them. Warfighting first. As a military, our primary responsibility is to deter aggression. And if deterrence fails, to win our nation's wars. As such, we must be ready to fight and win today, all the while building capability to win tomorrow. This is our primary mission, and all of our efforts must be grounded in this fundamental responsibility. Our own history shows that future conflict is not likely to appear in the precise form in which we've planned for. This means our military forces must be a credible force, able to decisively act and defeat any potential adversary. And to be clear, credible warfighting forces are deterrents. They are deterrents to those who might desire to use force or coercion to change the status quo. And as an example, I'll use my strategic missile submarines. They are on the front line and ready from the moment they get underway until they return to home port. And my strategic missile submarines must enter into the calculus of any potential adversary that would contemplate using nuclear weapons. And while it is hard to prove a negative, I'd submit that the U.S. strategic forces have contributed to preventing a nuclear war. That is their primary mission. The second tenet is to operate forward. Our military and our submarine force today remains a global force, operating forward from U.S. bases and locations throughout the world. The security and the prosperity of the United States, and indeed most nations, depends upon the freedom of the seas. 90% by volume of all goods imported into the United States comes from the sea. And as you know too well out here, about 40% of the world's trade passes through the 2-mile-wide Strait of Malacca. The unfettered flow of goods through the Strait of Malacca is critically important to this region and to the world. Our forward posture also supports friends, partners, and allies across a range of challenges, from piracy and terrorism to aggressive neighbors and natural disasters. Consider the response to the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, as well as last year's humanitarian assistance in the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan. Our goal remains where it matters, when it matters. I keep U.S. submarine forces operating forward through a combination of rotational deployments from the United States and by forward stationing submarine tenders and submarines in places like Guam and Diego Garcia. Next year, USS Topeka will arrive in Guam, bringing us to a total of 4 permanently stationed submarines in Guam. These Guam-based submarines provide the ability to conduct longer deployed operations in the region and also reduce our response time for emerging contingency operations in the Western Pacific. We have put considerable resources into Guam, including a new submarine training center, a new submarine squadron building, upgraded the piers, provided new housing, new gymnasium, and new military shopping facilities. Guam is a great location to conduct bilateral and multilateral submarine exercises and all the other parts that go along with those type of exercises. Guam also serves as a forward operating base for the 4 deployed SSGNs, which provide 365 days of coverage in the Western Pacific. And we have a second SSGN operating base in Diego Garcia. It provides 365 days of support and presence in the region around the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. The presence of our submarines in Guam should be taken as a sign that we are here to stay, dedicated to supporting this region and our mutual security interests. Lastly, operating forward provides offshore options to our civilian leadership. For example, during Operation Odyssey Dawn in Libya in 2011, an SSGN, USS Florida, launched more than 90 Tomahawk strikes into Libya and did this after being forward deployed for 13 months. These strikes allowed Allied warplanes to begin enforcing a no-fly zone over Libya. The third tenet is to be ready. My view is we should not expect to be given any advance warning of the next operational tasking. And being ready is more than just proper maintenance and adequate supplies. That's essential. But being ready also means we're proficient and confident in our ability to use our weapons, our sensors, our command and control. And today, more than any time in the past, being ready is about working and operating with our friends, partners, and allies. It's about training. It's about Talisman Sabre. It's about RIMPAC. It's about Lungfish. And it's about many, many more type of exercises. It's doing the grinding work that we do each and every day, individually and collectively, so that we are ready for whatever, whenever. I would think that the formation and execution of a Combined Joint Task Force 658 in support of the Malaysian airliner 370 is as a result of this type of long, dedicated work done by the Australian Defence Forces. Being ready is also about our sailors, unarguably our most valuable resource. It is easy to get caught up in the next great material thing, whether it's a sonar system, a UUV, a weapon, a periscope, you name it. And to a degree, that's okay. And it's expected. But there should be an equally aggressive race to recruit, train, and retain the sailors who man and women our submarines. They are as important as any weapon system we can buy and much, much more complex. I've been in the Pacific since 1991 in operational billets. I've seen firsthand, as many of you have, the increasing trend of countries acquiring submarines in the Asia-Pacific theater. This slide, using open source data, shows inventory by country in 2000 and the projected inventory, again, open source, newspapers type thing, projected inventory in 2025. So let me give you a few highlights. Vietnam just became the newest member of the club of countries that operate submarines, with delivery of 2 of the projected 6 Russian-built Kilo submarines. Bangladesh has just completed a deal with China to buy 2 used Ming submarines. India is the newest member of a small group of countries with both SSNs and SSBNs. And although still looking for a source to buy submarines, the Royal Thai Navy is actively establishing their submarine force infrastructure to prepare for the first submarine. And news reports have publicly identified they're aiming for a purchase of 3 submarines as part of a 10-year procurement plan. So as I look at this slide, I have 2 concerns. And I have these 2 concerns I discuss with every submarine force I visit. And both are safety related, and as such, should be a concern for every country that operates submarines. As the total number of submarines increases in this region, the risk will also increase of a sub-on-sub collision. Many ascribe to the big ocean, little submarine theory. I do not. Just as the air traffic controllers manage the airspace to prevent air-to-air collisions, we must do the same for the water. Among NATO submarine nations, water space management is broadly used and is managed by agreement. Unfortunately, it is not as broadly used here in the Asia Pacific. But as the undersea waterway becomes more crowded in this region, the need for water space management agreements becomes more and more important. Similarly, with so much trade traveling by the world's oceans, there is an ever-increasing risk of a submarine colliding with a commercial merchant vessel. In 2007, while submerged, USS Newport News collided with a 1,000-foot-long, 300,000-ton supertanker in the Strait of Hormuz. As the tanker passed over the submarine, its suction force drew the submarine upward, resulting in the collision. Fortunately, there were no personal injuries, and both ships sailed back to port under their own power. With these increased collision risks, my second safety concern is submarine rescue. I'll try not to steal Colonel Long's thunder from the next topic, but we must plan for the eventuality that we will need to rescue a submarine crew that has been disabled. Disabled on the surface is a relatively simple rescue, but disabled on the bottom is a challenge. Submarine rescue is a race against time, sometimes hours and sometimes days. We will rarely have more than that. To the extent that our navies or nations are slow to respond, to the extent that we lack the capability and don't seek help from others, or to the extent that our forces are uncoordinated and therefore inefficient, we will be outpaced and sailors will die. This is unacceptable and avoidable. That's why submarine rescue exercises like Pacific Reach and the multilateral Asia-Pacific Submarine Conference for submarine escape and rescue are so important. So with this as a backdrop, what do I see as my role, as our submarine force role in the Asia-Pacific? And I think to me it's pretty simple. Our prosperity and the prosperity of our friends, partners, and allies depends upon the stability of this region. And it depends on the unfettered flow of goods and services across the seas. The submarine is but one of the tools available to help foster regional stability, prosperity, and security. Additionally, the U.S. Submarine Force, I believe we have a role with all of our submarine nation partners in working through water space management agreements and submarine rescue procedures. I almost made it all the way through. There we go. Okay, I'm going to talk two points here about what I consider, as I look to the Asia Pacific, kind of a focus for my submarine force. Actually, there's 3 points that I think may be valuable for the discussion on the submarine choice. And first of all, I feel as SubPAC, as a type commander, one of my jobs, is providing the best submarines and submarine systems to my team. Large part of this is procurement and acquisition. Think Ohio replacement, think Virginia-class submarine programs. We have experts in those fields. I'm very comfortable and confident in that they will produce and deliver the equipment that my force needs. And so I focus more of my attention on modernizing our submarines, primarily in the tactical areas like sonar, ESM, navigation. In their simplest form, these systems are computers and processors and software. In our everyday lives, we are able to update our computer operating systems and download new apps very quickly. And usually, it's painless. It is the same concept though much more difficult, I understand, but it's the same concept that we need, our submarine force needs to push for when we talk about modernizing our submarines. And the key is to build this type of capability into the front end of the submarine, recognizing the submarine you build in 2020 will need to be modernized to be effective, superior, dominant force in 2030 or 2035 and follow on. Secondly, focus area for me, training, developing, and retaining my officers and sailors. Our Navy at large puts a lot of effort into training, developing, and retaining. But I think there's more that can be done. And primarily, my focus in this area is on leadership. And another of my slogans to my team is that leadership matters. And leadership at the deck plate has as much to do about retention as many other things that people will say contribute to retention. And it's very important that we all recognize that the families get to vote with respect to retention. Thirdly, and last, continuing to train with our partners, our friends, and our allies. Future operations, whether they are humanitarian assistance and disaster relief or submarine rescue, will be a combined effort. The more we train with each other, the more potent our combined forces will be. We should look for every opportunity to train with each other. And so lastly, this slide. Doesn't come up real well, but I'll tell you what it shows. It shows a nice sunset there above a horizon of water. As my wife looks at this slide, she sees the sunset. As I look at this slide, I see and I know of the submarines operating beneath that water and what they're doing. I'll never convince her that my view is correct. However, I recently attended a gathering similar to this, but it was mainly out there in the audience with a bunch of U.S. submariners. And up here on the podium, giving a talk, was a non-submariner. And he was giving a talk about his fascination with all things submarine-related. He loved the technology, the science, but most importantly, he loved the stories. He talked about the invention of submarine warfare with the advent of the Turtle submarine during our Revolutionary War. And then he talked about the Confederate ship, the Hunley, the first submarine that actually sank an enemy vessel. And these attracted his interest. They piqued his desire. But it was the stories of submarining during World War II that really caught his attention. Clay Blair, in his book Silent Victory, provided us the history and the stories of the U.S. Submarine Force's contributions during World War II. Silent Victory made household names in our submarine force of guys like Mush Morden and Wahoo, Dick O'Kane and Tang, and Gene Fluckey and Barb, and many, many other World War II submarine force heroes for the United States. To this day, the Pacific Submarine Force uses that book, reads a passage from that book whenever they award a set of dolphins to a crew member. It grounds the new members in our force into what our history is. It tells them describes our culture, tells them where we have come from. Then this speaker talked about our history during the Cold War till present. And unlike World War II, which is packed full of tellable tales, stories of great deeds and men, our recent history is largely blank. And blank not because we don't have the stories to tell, but blank primarily due to security concerns. The speaker, while fully recognizing the concern for security, thought this a shame. He chided us that we should find a way to tell our stories, to inspire a new generation of people that would be submariners. But for today, the operations we do at sea will remain largely untellable stories. For us to remain effective, we cannot widely discuss what or how we do. Our business, we must talk in only the most general terms. That said, I do think we should look to ways to tell our stories, to inspire the next generation of submariners, and perhaps to provide a broader education to the general public as we go forward in our times of budget issues. So with that, I'll leave the sunset picture up. I'll never convince my wife other than it's a sunset. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Can I ask you to raise your hands if you have a question and identify yourself, please?
I saw you writing it down as I was talking. I was wondering what you're writing down. I guess I'm going to find out.
Thanks, Admiral. Chris Skinner. You didn't mention specifically something that's on many people's minds of uninhabited vehicles, particularly uninhabited underwater vehicles. We heard Dr. Andrew Davies talk earlier about a scenario with lots of sensors and distributed architectures and so on. What sort of challenges do you see that each of those provide for the submarine force in the US Navy, and what sort of opportunities do you see opening up?
Yeah, good question, thanks. And I really, I think Dr. Davies had certainly talked on that topic, I think, fairly well, and that if you believe, and there's no reason you're not going to, about Moore's Law and the increasing processing capabilities going forward, then you also believe that there ought to be ways that we can put autonomous vehicles in the water or in the air, which, by the way, we've done both, and that they become a useful sensor. I believe that's true. I believe there's work to be done in that area. And I also believe that we look at that as complementary to what my submarine force can do. They can provide their information to me, just like they can provide it to somebody else. And so I often talk about extending the range of my ears and my eyes. How can I hear farther? How can I see farther? That's always the goal, right? I want to see beyond the horizon, whether it's see acoustically or see optically. I want to see that. And so however I can best do that, I think helps me in doing my mission, whether that's ASW, ASUW, you name it. The better I can see, the farther I can see and hear, the better off I am.
Let's take some more questions. Please. Brendan.
Very interesting. Admiral Brendan Nicholson from the Australian local newspaper. To what extent does the United States rely on Australia having a submarine force, and what sort of force, ideally, would that be if we are to cooperate effectively with the United States? And can conventional submarines, for instance, operate in a nuclear submarine environment that, as you say, is getting quite crowded?
Yeah, the environment that's getting quite crowded is the underwater environment. And so I would say we have effectively operated with the Collins-class submarine. I have operated with Collins-class submarine. I've partaked in the certification of Collins-class submarine when I was on Guam. They're a very effective submarine, and I think they would continue to be. I see no issue with nuclear submarines operating with diesel submarines. I think one of the earlier briefers very well kind of caged the pros and cons, and for whichever submarine you go to, there are pros and cons associated with that. You have to weigh them, truthfully, as a nation, of which way you think is the best way to go. And so my view is I look forward, as a U.S. Submarine Force officer operating here in the Pacific, I look forward with continuing to operate with the Australian Navy. I look forward to Sheehan coming out to RIMPAC this year. I look forward to whatever the next generation submarine is that you produce, I am positive we will be able to work interoperably with that submarine and truthfully in probably very complementary roles. Unfortunately, I go to the sunset picture here. It gets into the operation stuff that Admiral Samut, someone tried to grab him into it, and he would not go down that path, nor will I. But I think we will be very complementary forces between us and the Australians going forward.
Admiral, I had a question myself, if I may, about your reference to the need for water space management agreements. And I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts that you can share with us about what is a sensible approach to thinking about how to have this discussion in the region. Is this primarily a Navy-to-Navy exercise? Is it a case of starting with the Allies and the Friends first? Looking at that list of countries building submarines, it seems to me that there has to be ways that one can multilateralise some of those conversations, which may thrust the submarine community into a more public role than your last slide shows is sort of typical for the force. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about it. So how do we, having identified the need, how do we now start to progress to achieve some real outcomes in the region?
Right, and so great question, and truthfully, we work very closely with all the nations, and they really are. It starts as a Navy-Navy discussion, and usually, depending on the country and their organization, depends where that agreement finally, who gives the final approval authority. All these agreements are bilaterals, and so, for instance, with the Australians, with the French, with the Sings, we have these bilateral agreements. We can't talk anymore about them other than say it's a bilateral. We hold them very dear because, as you might expect, submarines are considered by us who operate them, certainly, and by our countries, as one of our jewels. And so we have to be very, very careful about making sure that we don't give away some of the technology inadvertently by how we do these agreements. And so it starts as Navy-to-Navy discussions, and then each Navy takes it up whatever their appropriate chain of command is to get agreement on it. So when I talked about the water space management out here, clearly there are many submarine countries that are already part of agreement. It's the new ones that are coming in that I am most concerned with, particularly as the numbers continue to increase. And it really requires, I'll say, a bit of trust in order to reach that type of agreement. And that trust is something that's built up over time. Another thing we always talk about is you can't surge trust. I can surge submarines, I can surge ships, but I cannot surge trust. And so it's by our actions that we generate that trust that will allow other countries to enter a bilateral agreement about water space management, with the whole goal of preventing submarine-on-submarine collision.
Thank you. Well, we've time for maybe one more question before we have a short break.
Peter, no need to force it.
The silent service.
Free time, white space.
They're just not trusting us enough. Oh no, it looks like second bite from Brendan.
Sorry to have a second bite, but submarines are designed to be as quiet as possible and to keep out of everyone's way. How technically do you go about actually keeping them or avoiding collisions, particularly if they're from countries that are potential adversaries?
Make sure they're not both in the same spot at the same time. That's how we do it, just like we do for aircraft.
And how do you do that with a foreign submarine?
Well, that would be the bilateral agreement that we would establish with that Navy. And those details will be Navy to Navy of how we establish that. Simple answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've reached a natural hiatus. We have a short break before we move to the next session. Can you please thank Admiral Sawyer?